It's not money that's supposed to go for anything other than us in our older years. You said, well...
The senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vacated.
Without objection. The question is on the Watt nomination.
For the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly.
Aye.
Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Boxer, Donnelly, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Kane, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, Merkley, Mikulski, Schatz, and Udall of New Mexico. Senators voting in the negative: Blunt, Chambliss, Collins, and Johans. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Moran, Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Cochran, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Scott, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Levin, Aye. Mrs. McCaskill, Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Hatch, Mr. Hatch, no. Mr. Begich, Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Flake, no. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Alexander, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. No. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Sessions, Mr. Sessions. No.
Okay. Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 57, the nays are 41, and the nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President,
The Majority
we
Leader.
have order in the Senate.
Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, that last vote took 30 minutes. We are not going to wait around for senators to come. We're going to start cutting off the votes. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, everybody. We can't do this. We have a lot of work to do. So it's unfair to everyone that gets here on time. So we're going to start cutting off the votes in 20 minutes. And I advise the floor staff that, in fact, is the case. We're not going to be waiting for people. It's wrong. It's unfair. I now move proceed.
The Senate will be in order. The Majority Leader.
I now move proceed to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not a vote on the Pillard nomination.
The question is on the motion to proceed. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu.
Money's money. I actually think they work better than the consumers because you give money back to people who have already been selected by the consumers being successful.
Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee,
A restaurant, why would you give them money?
Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy,
The other thing about looking at federal taxes, it won't hurt municipal things you need, like lights and stuff like that, because it's federal money. You know, it's not going to.
Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Levin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Enzi, Fisher, Blake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. Aye.
Are there any other senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 54, the nays are 44. The motion is approved. The Senate will be in order. The Majority Leader.
Nomination. I didn't have a microphone. I move to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked in the Pillard nomination.
The question is on the motion to reconsider. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Gary.
Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Sir. Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Yes, sir. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Begich, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Schatz, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Bozeman, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Sessions, Shelby, Toomey, and Wicker. Mr. Blunt? No. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? No. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn? No. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Burr? No. Mr. Vitter? Mr. Vitter? No. Ms. Landrieu? Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? No. Just check our head. Reed. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Rockefeller? Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker, no. Carper? Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, no. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? On this vote, the ayes are 54, the nays are 44. The motion to reconsider is agreed to. The question is on the motion to invoke cloture on the Pillard nomination upon reconsideration. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Cornelia T.L. Pillard of the District of Columbia to be United States